3 minutes after an urgent message arrived from Balmoral, Princess and allegedly triggered one of the most uncompromising royal interventions in recent memory, and the target was Prince Harry. Not money, not titles, not property. What reportedly sat at the center of this drama was a collection of sovereign documents powerful enough to reshape the monarchy's future. For generations, Balmoral has been more than a retreat. It has served as one of the Crown's most quietly fortified sanctuaries, a place where history breathes through private correspondence, confidential memoranda, and sovereign records never meant for public eyes. Those familiar with the institution have long understood something the outside world rarely grasps. The real power of the monarchy has never rested in its crowns. It has rested in its paperwork. What allegedly emerged caught even veteran palace officials off guard. Sources familiar with the matter suggest that concerns arose over a collection of sensitive documents believed to have originated from Balmoral's archives, and that somehow, those documents had become connected to Harry. What followed moved quickly. Anne, long regarded as the monarchy's most unsentimental guardian of protocol, reportedly requested immediate clarification on the status, custody, and handling of the papers. Inside royal circles, that alone was enough to send a signal. And does not act for spectacle. When she moves decisively, people pay attention. According to palace whispers, Harry allegedly received formal notice through established royal channels, a communication that, by most accounts, carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. The request, reports suggest, was simple: return the documents. But the deeper the story became, the more it revealed something larger than a paperwork dispute. This was never just about documents. It was about authority, stewardship, and the invisible architecture that sustains one of the world's oldest institutions, and who, in the end, gets to hold the keys. The distinction that allegedly sits at the heart of this controversy is one that sounds technical but carries enormous constitutional weight. Personal papers belong to their author. Sovereign documents belong to the institution, to the Crown itself, regardless of who holds it, who created them, or who believes they have a claim. That difference, insiders say, is precisely why alarms spread so quickly through palace channels. Throughout modern royal history, records touching on succession, private consultations, and institutional decisions have been handled with extraordinary care. Not because they necessarily contain explosive secrets, but because they represent something rarer and more fragile: continuity. The living memory of how the monarchy survives. Much of this conversation has inevitably turned toward the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. Following her death, significant attention was paid to the fate of her private archives. Those who knew her methods described those records as an extension of her lifelong devotion to duty, meticulously organized, carefully protected, and never treated as personal property. Protecting them was never merely about preserving history. It was about safeguarding the institution itself. Which makes the central question all the more unsettling. What exactly were the documents allegedly connected to Prince Harry? Some reports point to historical correspondence. Others whisper of memoranda tied to constitutional matters. Still others suggest the significance lies not in the contents at all, but in their classification. Whatever the truth, one detail has come to dominate discussion within royal circles. The concern was never simply that the papers existed. The concern was that they had moved. Because the moment questions arose about how documents left Balmoral, the nature of the controversy changed entirely. Ownership disputes and classification debates are manageable. A break in the chain of custody is something else. That, sources suggest, is when the matter escalated, and when figures responsible for protecting the monarchy's most sensitive records found themselves confronting questions with no comfortable answers. The question was no longer about ownership. It was about procedure. And in the world of royal administration, that shift matters enormously. Who had authorized the transfer? Under what authority had it occurred? Were the documents classified as personal records, institutional materials, or something in between? Sources familiar with palace practices suggest these distinctions are not bureaucratic formalities. They are the architecture that holds everything together. A misunderstanding involving ordinary correspondence creates inconvenience. A misunderstanding involving sovereign documentation creates something far more serious. What reportedly followed was a period of deepening administrative confusion. Different departments, different assumptions. Some officials believed the matter had moved through proper channels. Others allegedly questioned whether any approval had been granted at all. As more people sought clarity, conflicting accounts began to surface, and the absence of answers became almost as troubling as the documents themselves. Security implications soon entered the conversation. Not because wrongdoing had been publicly alleged, but because royal institutions are built on precedent. Once a sensitive document leaves a controlled environment, the questions are unavoidable. Who had access? How was it handled? Were proper records kept? Those familiar with palace security practices note that such reviews happen regardless of whether any breach occurred. The purpose is never accusation. The purpose is containment. But containment, some insiders feared, was precisely what was slipping away. Senior courtiers allegedly launched internal reviews, drawing in some of the most experienced figures within the royal household. The objective, sources suggest, was straightforward: establish the facts before speculation did further damage. Yet with every new review came another unsettling discovery. The deeper officials looked, the more questions multiplied. What had begun as an isolated administrative concern was starting to resemble something far larger, a direct challenge to the systems designed to preserve the monarchy's institutional memory. The pressure was mounting. And within that atmosphere of rising tension, one figure had reportedly seen enough. Princess and has spent decades avoiding headlines. She does not perform outrage. She does not court controversy. Her public image is one of disciplined reserve, showing up, doing the work, saying little. But those who know the institution well have long understood that behind that composure sits something far more formidable. When the monarchy's foundations are threatened, and does not observe from a distance, she acts. And according to palace whispers, as the crisis surrounding the Balmoral documents deepened, that reputation was about to become very relevant indeed. What had begun as a question about documents had become a question about something far harder to recover: institutional trust. Anne, by all accounts, was not interested in managing appearances. She wanted answers. Not where the papers were now, but how uncertainty had been permitted to develop around them at all. Sources suggest she pushed for a methodical internal review, tracing documentation, clarifying responsibilities, mapping every procedural gap. Those who have watched her operate over decades describe an approach entirely free of performance. She does not respond to crises through emotion. She responds through systems. Trusted palace advisors were reportedly drawn in. Legal specialists. Senior administrative figures. Long-serving officials. Some insiders describe the collective effort as a form of institutional self-defense, not because deliberate misconduct had been established, but because confidence in royal procedure had itself become the thing that needed protecting. Every unanswered question risked compounding into the next. Every delay gave speculation more room to grow. At the center of it all stood accountability. Who had approved the movement of the documents? Which safeguards had been followed, and which had been overlooked? In an institution built on continuity and precedent, these are never merely administrative questions. They are symbolic ones. They reassure future generations that the rules protecting the crown apply without exception, regardless of who is involved. Those familiar with palace history note that Anne has stepped into moments of institutional strain before. Her greatest strength has never been her public profile. It has been her consistency, the willingness to make difficult decisions when others retreat into delay. Tradition, in her view, survives only because someone is prepared to defend it. But even as she pressed for answers, some insiders began to sense that something deeper was surfacing beneath the procedural dispute. Something that might explain why concern had spread so quickly among figures who had seen genuine crises before. Because to outside observers, a document is simply a document. Papers can seem mundane, administrative, easily forgotten. But within the architecture of a constitutional monarchy, certain records carry a weight that has nothing to do with the ink on the page. Crown archives are not filing cabinets. They are repositories of institutional memory, preserving the decisions, consultations, and private correspondence that explain how the monarchy has survived periods of crisis, transition, and transformation across centuries. Some documents become historical artifacts. Others remain protected for generations, because their significance does not diminish with time. It deepens. The records allegedly at the center of this dispute are not relics. They remain connected to the living operation of the institution, potentially touching governance, succession planning, constitutional consultation, and administrative decisions that continue to shape the crown today. No public evidence has emerged identifying the specific documents involved. Yet sources suggest the possibility alone was enough to trigger alarm. Within royal circles, even the appearance of uncertainty surrounding sensitive materials carries consequences that extend well beyond any individual family member. The monarchy runs on continuity, and continuity depends entirely on trust in the systems built to protect it. Those who study royal administration frequently point to document security as something widely misunderstood. It is not primarily about preventing leaks. It is about maintaining clear accountability, ensuring that every transfer, every review, Every storage decision remains traceable within a framework designed to last across generations. Queen Elizabeth II's seven-decade reign is often cited as the standard. Countless documents passed through royal offices during those years, each contributing to a historical record that future generations would inherit. Protecting them was never treated as administrative housekeeping. It was treated as a core function of the institution itself. Which is precisely why the alleged breakdown in custodial clarity struck some senior figures so deeply. The fear, according to insiders, was never solely about this particular situation. It was about precedent. If exceptions become normalized, future disputes grow harder to contain. If procedural boundaries blur once, they become easier to challenge again. For an organization built on tradition, even a small procedural failure can carry consequences that echo far longer than anyone anticipates. And so, almost inevitably, the focus shifted. Questions that had centered on records and procedures began pointing toward one person. What role had Prince Harry played in the chain of events? What had he known? And how had materials connected to some of the monarchy's most protected archives reached this point at all? The timing, observers note, could hardly have been more freighted. By the time the Balmoral documents entered wider royal conversation, Harry already carried years of complicated history with the institution. Once among its most popular and relatable figures, he had since become associated with a series of public departures, high-profile disclosures, and disputes that had fundamentally altered his relationship with the crown. That history, many suggest, made the latest controversy almost impossible to contain within its own boundaries. Concerns about the documents became inseparable from broader questions about trust. For royal watchers, the issue was no longer simply whether papers had moved or whether procedures had been followed. It was unfolding against the backdrop of a relationship already believed to be deeply, perhaps irreparably, strained, and every previous disagreement seemed to surface alongside it. Harry's earlier decisions had never fully left the room. His willingness to discuss private royal matters, in interviews, documentaries, a published memoir, had drawn fierce admiration from some and equally fierce condemnation from others. Admirers called it honesty. Critics called it a generational breach of an unwritten code. When reports emerged connecting him to sensitive documents from Balmoral, those earlier conflicts didn't merely provide context. They became the lens through which almost everything was interpreted. The media response accelerated what palace whispers had started. Speculation multiplied across newspapers, commentary channels, and royal analysis circuits almost daily. What exactly had Harry received? Did he grasp the significance of the materials? Was there a genuine misunderstanding about authorization? Or was the entire controversy being distorted by competing agendas? In the absence of clear answers, public debate filled the vacuum, and quickly polarized. Perception began moving faster than fact, and the gap between them widened with every passing day. At the center of it all stood Harry, his intentions endlessly debated, his awareness of the growing palace concern openly questioned. Was he simply the recipient of materials passed through ordinary channels? Had communication between different parties simply broken down? The questions lingered unresolved, feeding the very fascination they claimed to interrogate. What had begun as a dispute about documents had become something far more charged, a symbolic confrontation involving trust, loyalty, and the deeply fractured relationship between an institution and one of its most controversial members. Yet even as the headlines fixed on Harry, some insiders quietly noted that the most consequential decisions were being made elsewhere. Because behind the spectacle stood another figure carrying a different and perhaps heavier burden entirely. King Charles was not watching from a distance. According to various interpretations, he found himself caught precisely where monarchs have always found themselves when personal history collides with constitutional duty, at the intersection of two obligations that cannot be fully reconciled. On one side, a father, on the other, a sovereign, both pulling in directions that tradition has never made easy to navigate simultaneously. It is one of the monarchy's oldest tensions. Throughout centuries of royal history, rulers have repeatedly faced moments when family loyalty and institutional responsibility refuse to align. Those familiar with royal dynamics suggest Charles was experiencing precisely that, and that the Balmoral controversy had transformed, in the eyes of those watching closely, into something beyond a procedural dispute. It had become a test of reign. How a king responds when the personal and the constitutional collide says something lasting about the kind of monarch he intends to be. And with the relationship between the crown and Prince Harry already defined by cycles of fragile optimism and renewed strain, the emergence of yet another controversy threatened to close doors that some had hoped might still be open. Senior advisors, sources suggest, understood the terrain with uncomfortable clarity. An aggressive response risked deepening divisions that were already close to permanent. A passive one risked signaling that institutional safeguards were negotiable. Neither outcome was acceptable. And so a more delicate path was sought, one that would protect procedure without turning a crisis into a rupture. Princess Anne's influence, meanwhile, continued to shape discussions well beyond what was publicly visible. Her reputation within the institution rests on a quality that has become increasingly rare, the perception that her judgments are driven not by relationships, but by responsibility. Where others weigh feeling, Anne is understood to weigh obligation. Sources suggest that this made her calls for accountability harder to dismiss, and quietly increased the pressure on King Charles to address the matter with the directness it demanded. What followed, by most accounts, was a period of intense and largely silent deliberation. Communication channels stayed open. Advisors continued reviewing the available information. The focus, sources claim, remained fixed on reducing uncertainty before it hardened into something permanent. But one reality could not be managed away. The longer questions remained unanswered, the more difficult containment became. The situation carried no clean resolution. Family loyalty demanded understanding. Constitutional duty demanded clarity. Public scrutiny demanded answers. And beneath all of it ran a quieter, more lasting pressure. The awareness that future generations would examine how the monarchy behaved in moments precisely like this one. The controversy had grown larger than any individual at its center. As the dust began to settle, reports suggest the emphasis gradually shifted away from confrontation and towards something closer to stewardship. The objective, sources claim, was never punishment. It was preservation, a reaffirmation of the principle that certain responsibilities outlast any personality, any headline, and any temporary dispute. In that sense, the story was never truly about documents. It was about what documents represent inside an institution built on the weight of precedent. Within the House of Windsor, records are not administrative debris. They are vessels of authority, memory, and continuity. The physical evidence that the monarchy endured, adapted, and held its shape across centuries of pressure. And through the length of this controversy, one figure remained its most consistent embodiment. Princess Anne did not enter this story seeking influence. She entered it because, by her own apparent reasoning, someone was required to. Duty before popularity. Obligation before convenience. Protocol before personality. It is a set of values she has carried for decades, and in this moment, whether history ultimately vindicates every detail of the reports surrounding it or not, those values placed her exactly where they have always placed her. At the center of what the monarchy believes itself to be. Princess Anne's involvement, sources consistently maintained, was never personal. No grievance drove it. No political calculation shaped it. What drove her, by all accounts, was something far simpler and far older, the conviction that traditions endure only because someone is willing to stand in front of them. In moments of institutional uncertainty, the true guardians of any organization reveal themselves. For many observers, Anne emerged from this episode as exactly that. The symbolism surrounding the reported return of the documents carried its own quiet weight. Within royal culture, restoring something to its proper place is never merely administrative. It is a reaffirmation of order, a declaration that stewardship matters, that certain responsibilities belong not to individuals but to the institution entrusted with carrying them forward. Those who view the monarchy through the lens of continuity, sources suggest, felt that symbolism deeply. Hovering over all of it, as it so often does, was the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. Her influence continues to shape royal life in ways both visible and invisible. Those familiar with her reign describe it as a masterclass in custodianship, built on the understanding that monarchy survives not by resisting change, but by fiercely protecting the principles that give it legitimacy. That standard, many observers noted, framed the controversy from its very first whisper to its quietest resolution. The debate was never really about records. It was about honoring what she spent a lifetime building. And perhaps that is where the deepest truth of this episode resides. Every generation within the royal family faces the collision between personal desire and institutional obligation. Some meet it with grace. Others struggle. But the monarchy's survival has always rested on a single enduring idea, that service to the institution must ultimately outlast individual preference. The Balmoral controversy became another chapter in that long, unfinished story. A reminder that legacy is never simply inherited. It is earned, protected, and sometimes defended at considerable personal cost, in choices that rarely make headlines and sacrifices the public rarely sees. Long after the speculation fades, the principle remains. The stewardship of history demands vigilance. The preservation of trust demands discipline. And the guardianship of a legacy that spans centuries demands individuals willing, when the moment arrives, to place principle above everything else. In the silent halls of Balmoral, where history is preserved one document at a time, that lesson has never changed. The crown forgives many things. It never forgets who protected it. The story doesn't end here. It never does with the House of Windsor. If you want to know what happens next, before the headlines catch up, hit subscribe now. Every secret has a sequel. Every controversy leaves a shadow. And we follow both. Like this video if the truth matters to you. And if you're new here, welcome to the only place covering the royal family the way it actually deserves to be covered, without the spin, without the filter, and without looking away. The next chapter is already unfolding. Don't miss it.